where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here and a proud member. Today's August 14th. You're with a virtual City Club forum live from the studios of 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream. They are our public media partner, and we're deeply grateful for their assistance and support. Earlier this week, former Vice President Joe Biden announced that Senator Kamala Harris of California will be his vice presidential running mate, making her the first woman of color to be nominated for national office by a major political party, and only the fourth woman in U.S. history to be chosen for a presidential ticket. All of those, of course, contingent on what happens at the Democratic National Convention later this summer. The history of women in politics is long and complicated in America. It was 100 years ago this year, on August 19th to be exact, that the United States ratified the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Though because of ballot access restrictions in place for many years following, many women of color were not able to exercise the right to vote in the same way as their white counterparts. In the last 100 years, though, our nation has made great strides, but when it comes to equal representation for women in government, there's still a long way to go. The documentary film Represent follows three first-time female candidates as they run for office and work to improve their communities through public service. The film had its world premiere at the 44th Cleveland International Film Festival, which was a streaming event this year due to COVID. And Represent is now being screened in select cities, including Cleveland, to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Today, we'll talk with Hillary Bachelder. She's the director, cinematographer, and editor of the documentary, and Ohioan Bryn Bird, whose journey running for office in Granville Township is chronicled in the film. As in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions. Text them to 330-541-5794. Again, to text your questions, just text them to 330-541-5794. And if you're on Twitter, you can tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them into the program. Hillary Bachelder and Bryn Bird, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Hi, thank you.
It is great to have you both with us. Hillary Bachelder, I want to start with you. There are all sorts of reasons why a documentary like this needed to be made, but why did you need to make this documentary?
So the film really started for me on election day 2016, when I stepped into sort of the voting booth and had just a moment of completely coincidental and superficial representation. Hillary Clinton was on the ballot, and as a woman, that was, the significance had not escaped me before that moment. But on that day, for whatever reason, it just hit me that I was looking at my name on the ballot as a fellow Hillary. And so that was sort of, again, it was coincidental representation. It was superficial, but it still felt important. And so as I left, and kind of as we were all picking up the pieces following the election, I was really kind of tuned into this question of what does it take and what does it mean for women running for office in the country today, and how can we be achieving greater gender parity? And I kind of had this persistent theme that I wanted to explore around representation in particular, because I think this film asks more, beyond just being a woman. What does it mean to bring your full identity, your full self into a public space? And so that's part of the kind of connective tissue of the three stories that we followed as well.
Tell us about the three stories.
Yeah.
And maybe end with Bryn as an introduction, as a deeper introduction to her.
So the three stories, we followed a young woman who was 22 at the time, who ran for mayor of Detroit. That was Maya Jones in 2017. We followed a conservative Korean immigrant, Julie Cho, who was running for state representative in Illinois. And we followed Bryn Bird, who is a progressive produce farmer who ran for township trustee in Granville, Ohio.
Progressive produce farmer, Bryn Bird. Bryn Bird, why did you run for office?
So I think my story has always kind of gone back. I think I always knew I wanted to run for office. When I announced I was running for office, one of my second grade classmates from Colorado actually reached out to me, and he told me he remembers in second grade when I stood up and I guess proclaimed that I was going to be a politician one day. So I think the arc has been long for me on this, but my grandfather was a township trustee in Ohio as well. And I did grow up in Colorado until middle school. And so I never lived in Ohio at the time that my grandfather was alive. But I remember as a small child coming to visit him and going down into the middle of town, and he would prop me up, on a stool, right? It was not a bar, it was like a coffee shop, prop me up on this stool. And, everybody would come in and talk to him and knew him and ask him for help with problems, simple problems from, we have a problem with our driveway. There's a problem at the end of our road. And I remember just thinking how amazing everybody knew who he was. Everybody came to him with questions and concerns. And when he passed away, his funeral was huge. I mean, just, the hundreds of people showing up and just saying how much that he impacted their life and how much he played a role in their life. And so I always knew at that time how important local government was, because you are helping people like with very tangible problems, with relational problems with their neighbors. And that, does, I think, impact people a little bit more than sometimes, what's happening at the national level. It's, you don't feel that as fast and as quick. So I always knew that is the role I kind of wanted to go into. And in 2016 and 2017, I didn't really run because of the results of the 2016 election. I did know that, there just was so much distrust in government at that point. And I have always believed that our divide can start to be healed, I think, at the local level, and really focusing at the local level and rebuilding our trust in our government, reminding our peers and our friends and our neighbors that, these politicians are people too, and that you can talk to them and you can have a relationship with them, and kind of rebuilding that trust was important to me. At that time too, my mom was, she had cancer for the previous 5 years, but her cancer, we had found out was terminal at that point. And I think for me, a big part of running at that in 2017 was because I wanted her to see me run. I wanted her to kind of see who I was becoming. She was very mad that I was running. She was so worried that she'd hear people say mean things about me in the newspaper. But I think she was also supportive. But I think I ran at that exact time because I wanted her to see me run. But I always knew that I wanted to run for a very local position and work on rebuilding that trust and just being in relationship with my community. It's painful and amazing at the same time.
Painful and amazing. And some of the pain that you experience is specific to being a woman in office. And I guess I just, like, spoiler alert, you won your election. Bryn Bird now serves as a township trustee in Granville, Ohio, in the township of Granville, which is not the same as the village of Granville. No. But Bryn Bird, could you speak a little bit about the specific pains of being a woman running for office and a woman in office in a role that in Granville Township has traditionally not fallen to women?
Yeah. And when I ran, there was a woman in office, and I am pretty sure Melanie was the first woman. Hillary, did I think we confirmed that she was the first woman to have ever been a trustee, and she was elected right before the term before I ran. And so there was a woman, and even when I started to say I was going to run, immediately we started hearing that it was more I was running against her because there wouldn't be two women in office. And that definitely was the language, that was a common thing that we heard, is that, we have one, but we can't have two. And I think for me too, at my age, and talking with Maya and Julie, the three of us have talked a lot about our experiences. And I think my experience as a woman also was followed along the lines that I'm a mom of young children. When I ran, I had I think when I started, she was like 3 and 18 months, because now they're like 6 and 4. And so this idea that I was carrying around, less, an 18-month-old, I think she might have been a little bit even younger than that when we really started. And so this idea that I had these young children played into the narrative of me being a woman most often, of how could I do it with young children? Is that fair to them? And, I have the stories, that I've shared in the documentary too, of when people would kind of ask if I was able to be at meetings because who would put my children to bed. And that's one that just has not stopped. Anytime we have evening meetings or early morning meetings, that is just a question I'm continually asked. Well, who can put the kids to bed? Who will put the kids to bed? And, you know, I have a very supportive husband and partner who puts the kids to bed. And I was even asked if I could, you know, when I was going on one of my first committees, they asked, you know, is this okay for you to be on this committee because who will put your kids to bed? And so for me, I think a lot of it being a woman has been a mother of young children. You know, I think Maya and Julie experienced it in a different way too, of being an inexperienced woman because Maya was young, and Julie, you know, she's a woman who's older and her kids are like in activities and busy and stuff like that. And so it's been interesting too to see how all of us had it play out differently versus the phase of life we were in, but always around this idea, like if we were, you know, I think if my husband was running, nobody would ever ask
who's going to put your kids to bed.
Never.
Right.
That like, and honestly, it bugs my husband, and he brings that up all the time of, it just, he hate, you know, that narrative that, you know, he takes the kids to Lowe's and everybody stops to say how amazing he is. A mom takes the kids to the grocery store and everybody, you know, asks her to keep them quiet. So it's kind of like, there's definitely that double standard. And I think it frustrates him how much people tell him like how great he is, that he's taking care of our kids.
Well, you're both great. And the film really does demonstrate that, the depth of commitment as a family that you have to public service. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Bryn Bird. She's a trustee in Granville Township in central Ohio, and Hillary Bachelder, the director and producer of a film called Represent, which is receiving its theatrical release, such as it is, streaming through a variety of movie theaters across the country. And that's happening today and this week in anticipation of the sort of 100th anniversary celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The film, as I said, is called Represent, and you should absolutely look it up. If you missed it when it screened at the Cleveland International Film Festival, in their streaming festival, early in like COVID 1.0, I guess is what we might refer to those days as. Hillary Bachelder, talk a little bit about the similarities among these stories, these three women, Bryn, along with Julie Cho and Maya Jones.
So on paper, there's such different women running such different races, which was a little intentional. You know, we were looking for instance, like we found we have like an urban, a suburban, and a rural story. They're running for different offices. They're at different, you know, ages of life. They have different sort of communities that they're connected into and finding support. And they're running on both sides of the aisle as well. We have two Democrats and a Republican. So there's, on paper, not much beyond sort of that, you know, they're all women, ties them together. But kind of hearkening back to what I was bringing up earlier, I think what really connects them, and this was something that I found the more that I actually got into shooting, it took a couple of years of being with them all to start tying it together and getting into the edit. But they all are women who are really trying to do this kind of on their own terms. And once they stepped up to run, they were sort of confronted with, okay, you can be a woman in this space, but it has to look like this. And, you know, for Bryn, I would say that's like, yeah, okay, you're a woman, but your kids have to either not be here or they need to be really quiet in the back. And Bryn's like, I'm here, I'm showing up to this meeting and my kids might make some noise, but that's not going to stop us from doing our jobs. And so, you know, that's part of what Bryn is taking on in her race and that we see in the film. For Maya, as a Black woman, as a young Black woman in Detroit, she's sort of constantly having folks tell her how she should present herself and her story. And it's something we see her wrestling with over the course of the film, from her campaign team to, you know, other members of the Democratic Party who she does kind of has to navigate some level of code switching around. And then her own campaign team, we see kind of pushing her to tell her story in a way that connects to like the Black experience in Detroit. And she's just throughout the course of the film, she's continuing to say, you know, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to bring my full self into this space, and I'm going to be Maya, because that's why I'm running, and other people need to see me as I am and not have to shrink myself to fit whatever this narrative of what's acceptable in a politician is. And for Julie, I think she's really struggling as a conservative who's running in a very democratic, solidly democratic district in the Chicago suburbs. She gets a lot of flack from her own party, who are trying to convince her to drop out because they don't think her race is viable. And as well as from the other side, from the Democrats. And Julie is really trying to hold the line and say, you know what, I identify as a Republican as I identify with the core philosophy that being a Republican is about small government. That's her thing. And everyone else around her is trying to tell her what that should mean, and ask her to sort of respond and apologize for Trump. And she's like, well, I'm not Trump. I'm Julie Cho. I'm running as me, and again, sort of refuses to compromise on her ideological values in the similar way that we see kind of Bryn and Maya refusing to compromise on their identities and families and everything else as well. So I think that ended up being, and again, it was something that took me the course of filming with each of them to identify, oh, this is what ties them together.
Mm-hmm.
In 2020, it's almost impossible to talk about politics without in your brain going to Hamilton, if you've seen it. And as listening to you talk about that, I was thinking about how important the theme that you're pointing to is about who gets to tell their own story, and whose narrative. And narratives, the political narrative, Bryn, your own narrative doesn't really fit in the Granville story necessarily, or the traditional understanding of the Granville story, or even the Democratic Party story necessarily. Hillary, in the same way that you were talking about Maya Jones, there's a very poignant moment where her campaign team is trying to get her, as you said, to play up the poor Black girl from Detroit story. And she's like, that's not my story. I'm not going to do that. And which is really interesting. It's a really interesting moment. Bryn, did you find it difficult to tell your own story?
Yes, especially at the beginning, I was getting advice to really kind of attack the old, the quote unquote old boys club, and to really like go after that they were trying to suppress the woman and to do some of that. And especially around like a fire station issue, which Hillary could say that's so small town too. And for me to really push back. And at the beginning, some of my early supporters really wanted me to go down that narrative of, this old boys club and I'm fighting against the old boys club. And I never felt that that's why I was doing it or what I was coming at it. Like I said, I did I wanted a Granville that was represented from multiple generations, that did have representation of younger families that are coming to the community looking 30, 40, 50 years out, how to protect our rural integrity and our rural heritage, but understanding, where we're headed and how do we, think about that and not be so defensive and how we become offensive. And so I think that was a lot of my story that I wanted to get out, was this idea of representation generationally. And instead it was kind of like, they really wanted me to attack it more. The old boys club is trying to keep you women down. And it was really hard to do that because, like we said, Melanie was already a trustee. So there already was a woman trustee. And so early on, I got a lot of emails and people trying to take meetings and saying, this is how you should attack it. And again, like my role position is a nonpartisan position. And that was important for me to stay nonpartisan, as a trustee. And again, because I do think it's just a place where we can build this better community and build relationship and build trust amongst people of different parties. And I've continued to see that as a trustee. We come together on a lot of things, and it's great to not have to like vote against the other guy just because they're on the other side of the aisle. We can come together.
Did it surprise you how much unsolicited advice there was out there for you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot of unsolicited advice. And I think it would be very hard to run even, going into higher office, because I already saw people who would speak on your behalf. And I know that even one, position higher, you start to get state parties like sending out mailers for you. You get PACs that start to send things out for you. And I can't imagine having people speak for you more than I already had in such a small position in a small election, who were saying, that I would agree with things, and having to go back and say, well, I didn't say that.
Huh.
So.
Were there people who told you not to run because you're a woman and it's not women's work?
I had a lot of people with being a mother of young children, that this was not the time. This was not, I needed to, how would I have time to do it with young children? And that as a mom, I had somebody who said, I really do want to vote for you, but I'm just so worried how, I know that being a trustee means you have to take meetings any time of the day, and that, it's a lot of like immediate help with certain things. And how will you do that with kids? And so a lot of that was around just young kids. And I was thinking too back, Liz Brown, Senator Brown's daughter, she's a Columbus city councilwoman in Columbus. And there was a picture that came out right before I made the decision in my heart that I was going to run. And it was of her voting. And she has her oldest her oldest couldn't have been a couple weeks old, swaddled up. And she's carrying the oldest voting for herself in her first election. I remember seeing that picture and how that representation was so powerful to me, of if she is doing this in Columbus and just with where she is, with all eyes on her, I can do this too. And actually Liz graduated from Granville High School. I graduated from the high school one over, but she's from Granville as well. And so I think her representation of her and her I think son really helped me know that, like, yes, people are going to tell me not to run because I have small children, but why do people say that?
Well, I suppose it's just sort of I would guess that it sort of is a symptom of the limitations of their own imagination,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. But I'm noting that, this idea of voting and getting to cast a ballot for yourself, seeing your own name on the ballot, similar to the story that Hillary told at the beginning of seeing just her first name on the ballot, which was somewhat inspiring, but to see your whole name, Bryn Bird, on the ballot, what did that feel like? I know you brought your children to vote with you.
I did. And I did not realize that my mic was still on when I went in the voting booth. And so Hillary and her amazing documentarian, and if you don't, get to watch everything, watch the trailer for sure of the documentary, because Hillary did a great job of even editing that part. And I did vote, and I took my daughter in with me, and, asked her to remember that moment that we were voting and what that meant. And I do think about it with my children when people kind of push back against me, is I grew up and my parents went to vote together. They would always have a date. They would drop us off. They would go on their little date, go voting, and go to breakfast. I remember it was a big deal in our family. But my parents weren't really engaged politically after that. And I keep thinking, where will my daughters be, and where will they grow up to be? Knowing that knowing that not just like voting, but running for office, being on committees, being engaged. My husband, he does work in the community, and all of our civic engagement. And where will they be? This is just their norm. Their norm is that you see your mom's name on a ballot. Their norm is that you just stand up and vote, or that you just go to protests, or you go to rallies. Like for them to grow up where that's just what's natural for them, I can't imagine where they're going to go from here. I am so excited to see where their engagement and how they will give back to the community will be.
Hillary Bachelder, telling that story is a way of normalizing the story and making people more familiar with the mere facts of that kind of thing. Was that the motive?
Yeah, it's funny to me that this is sort of needs to be done, but this is a film that says politicians are people, because too often all we're really presented with is a campaign commercial, the brochure that gets stuffed into your door. We don't see the multifaceted kind of full side of the people who often run for office, and so that was from the beginning that I knew that was part of why I wanted to tell this story. And I think it's important too, when you're trying to encourage other women to run, which I hope that they watch the film and find inspiration there. but to see sort of the imperfections that come with running, and that you don't have to, you don't have to be so shiny and so polished. And there's a learning curve for everyone. We see it with each of these women in the film. And that's okay. That's okay to be starting just from a place of like passion and interest and commitment to running, and the rest you'll kind of figure out along the way.
Hilary Bachelder is a filmmaker. The film is called Represent. It follows the stories of 3 women who are running for office for the first time. One of those women, Bryn Bird, is with us today, and Bryn is with us because we're in Ohio, and Bryn represents the citizens of Granville Township as a Granville Township trustee, a race that she won in 2017. Sorry to spoil that part, but the film is still on the way. The journey to the victory is still very much worth following. The others in the film include Julie Cho, who was running for state representative in a suburb of Chicago, the Evanston area, I believe, and then as well as Maya Jones running for mayor of Detroit. And it's a fascinating set of stories. Represent is premiering theatrically this weekend, starting today, in honor of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which happened 100 years ago next week. If you have questions for our guests today at the City Club Friday Forum, please text them to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794. You can tweet them at the City Club, and we'll work them into the program. I'm curious, Bryn Bird and Hilary Bachelder, about the role of debates. There's a big question. We've got presidential debates coming up, the first one of which will be held in Cleveland, Ohio at the Cleveland Clinic, co-presented with Case Western Reserve University. And the City Club itself has been host to a number of debates and candidate forums over the years. Bryn Bird, how important were candidate forums and debates in your very local race?
So when I ran, we didn't really have a debate between the other candidates, but there has been since in a lot of the township races, and in the one last year, they did have a forum. And I do have to kind of laugh on a local level, and especially in the Midwest, we are very polite people, and we are very polite and we're very local. And so I feel like they have stayed very, very vanilla. They're very nice and polite. And we had one recently, and it was more like they'd ask the questions and then the person would give their answer, and then there was really no like back and forth. And I do always kind of question on the very local level how well they go. I do think the forums are important so people have a chance to meet people. But I've actually thought about in the future, even asking the Chamber of Commerce if it can't be more of like a meet and greet, where we maybe do answer a few questions and then go into a meet and greet forum where we can kind of be more one-on-one. Because again, even voters in our small towns where we have to live together now for the next, hopefully 50, 60 years. And our kids all go to school together, and we stand next to each other at the soccer field, and we hang out at the coffee shop. So I think people don't ever want to be too offensive. And there's been some great academic writing recently, I think, on like the politeness of Midwest politics and how sometimes it can be to our own detriment when we do have a harder time debating publicly against each other. So if that is how it is, then how do we give, I think, a better option for people to maybe get those tough answers that they need where they feel comfortable. So I did not have a debate, and I have thought for the next year when I run for re-election, kind of bringing it up to the chamber, I'd love to get the hard questions, but is that in a debate setting, or should it be more in a forum?
Hilary Bachelder, having been a sort of a student of the campaigns, of these 3 campaigns, what did you think about the role of debates?
So as Bryn mentioned, she did not take part in a debate that year. Julie Cho had one debate, I believe, with her opponent, or I guess it was a League of Women Voters Forum. That I thought was helpful. There were a few questions from the audience, and they were able to talk through some issues. The one that Maya took part in that I was able to film, and this actually didn't make it into the final edit of the documentary, but she did take part in a larger candidate forum, but was frustrated because actually the top 2 sort of contenders for the mayoral election decided not to show up. And so it felt very much like sort of a slight that they were above actually having to sit and field questions from the audience. So I that sort of speaks volumes to me, that like of the importance of those public settings. And I do think even in the local elections, it's a chance for folks to interact and hear more about what the offices do as well. Because I think sometimes, and Bryn, I'm sure, has experienced this as well, but sometimes people don't quite know what the responsibilities of these local offices are. And so you get a lot of questions like, oh, can you fix this? And, you know, those folks have to be like, that's not my job, not my job. But I think all of that is sort of important in terms of just keeping an engaged and informed electorate.
Let's turn now to questions from our audience. Again, if you have a question, please text it to 330-541-5794, or you can tweet it at the City Club, and we'll be asking them now in the second half of our City Club Friday Forum. The film makes it clear that all three candidates featured needed meaningful support. What support was, or in the case of the candidates who didn't win, is needed most? What do they need? Campaign teams, money, endorsements, other things, all of the above?
All of the
Hillary?
above. Yeah, all of the above. I mean, I think it's so critical to have a campaign team that's engaged, that's going to go to bat for you, that's going to help knock doors. There's just, even in these really local races, there's just so much work to do, and you need the team around you. I think you need sort of friends and family level support too, the folks who you can vent to when things are, you know, when you're being attacked publicly or when things just aren't going your way. Like, you need the people in your life with kind of any major endeavor that are going to have your back. Absolutely, they need money. Fundraising is still a challenge, a special challenge for women and women of color. That's like a pretty significant barrier that a lot of them face. And I think party level support too is really critical, and that's something that we tried to show in the film, and we see it from both parties actually. You know, the parties aren't necessarily great at building up those pipelines that are required, especially at the local level. Who are the great candidates? Who are the great community leaders who are out there doing that kind of work and maybe could make a pivot into public office? So trying to identify those women at an earlier stage so that they can get more institutional training. And there are things that come with a party level endorsement. You know, they will send out mailers for you. They will help make calls, and they might give you money. You know, all of those help people get over the finish line.
Hillary, the story that you tell of Julie Cho's campaign is a very lonely story. Was it really it was just her and her campaign manager that whole time?
They did have a larger campaign team, and I filmed some of those meetings, and they just didn't kind of make it into the film for whatever reason. It definitely was a bit of Julie and Bobby against the world. And I thought I kind of loved their relationship as a duo. He was a younger Black guy who had only really represented, I think, Democratic candidates until Julie showed up, but they found themselves aligned on this issue of gerrymandering and fair redistricting reform. So they're kind of the unlikely pairing that takes on the world. And Bobby really got a lot of flack from the Democratic Party and sort of talks about being blacklisted. His mom actually works in politics as well, and his mom was even getting blacklisted from other Democratic campaigns. And you know, as we see in the film, Julie is up against it from the Democrats and the Republicans as well. So I think, you know, there's some degree that there's selective editing and there's only certain scenes that you end up shooting. But I think in spirit, it was really kind of the two of them.
Bryn Bird, what was your campaign? I mean, running for a township trustee is somewhat smaller than trying to run for mayor of Detroit, say. Nevertheless, you still need a little of all of the same things, right? What did you have? What did you need?
Yeah, I think Hillary really hit it. For me, I think what was most important was my campaign friendships, my campaign circle. I had like a little kitchen table board, kitchen table trust that, was a group of volunteers that I could ask to do anything. And without them, I wouldn't have been able to get to office. And what's really neat is 3 of the people who helped me every day, day in, day out, are now, one is in office and one is currently running for office for state school board. And so that was a really cool takeaway is, people who volunteered and have said, it was kind of working with my campaign that made them think I could do that too. And so that's been a really neat part of it, is that Hillary got to know them and now they're all in office. I also think from the party support, being a first-time candidate, there's a thing called VAN, and it has all of our voter, number scores, our propensity for voting, and it cuts the turf and shows you which house to go to and knock on based on are they going to vote or not. And I would never have been able to have access to that or known how to utilize that without my county party. Sitting down, and that there's a scene that Hillary does, I know makes it into the final documentary, where Aaron is meeting with us. It's when my kids throw the food on the ground. And Aaron's meeting with us and showing us how to use that tool that comes through the party. And without that, I never would have gotten to where we were, because that is how you run as a sophisticated candidate. But that training came out of the county party, or came out of the party. And so I think there is that level of support that the two-party system is not perfect, but that is how we kind of have to work to get some of that education. But how do we get it to all candidates, no matter how tiny their office or how new they are or how not likely they are to win? And again, Hillary said too, I do think that we are giving money to women, and we are starting to accept, and I think, promote women running for office, but women of color still are not getting the same level of candidate financial support. They're just not able to fundraise the same way. There's a lot, around just all candidates of color, but especially women of color. And so I think, as we are giving our dollars, if we want representation, looking to candidates that give that representation and continuing to support financially those campaigns. I do think it's a call on everybody, to think about, who are you voting? Is it just people that look like you, or are we making sure that we financially support all candidates too?
This is connected to another question from a listener who writes, I enjoyed the film when I saw it through the film festival, but the lack of emphasis on fundraising was a concern, especially when it's often the biggest barrier for women entering politics. Can you speak to that? And I know that there are some organizations that have emerged, like Matriots and others, who are seeking to support women across party lines just to get more women into office. But I also know that there are a lot of people who write checks who, if a woman knocks on their door or calls them on the phone, will encourage them not to run because they don't think they're going to win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I do think there's a lot of organizations that are supporting, women running, but then you have to almost adopt their platform. I've been approached about running for higher office, and when those conversations happened, a lot of it was, you raise this amount of money, then we'll back you on this amount of money, and then this PAC will give you this amount of money. But to get that amount of money, then you have to sign a pledge that you believe and will follow this platform. And so again, as we talked about earlier, are we always able to tell our true, run our true campaign, tell our true self story when we get into fundraising and you start to have money given, but it comes, with platform promises. And I think that is something that luckily locally we didn't have to get into. But as I've been approached about other offices, that definitely has been brought up. And again, so that sometimes I continue to think about, when we're giving money, are we giving it directly to candidates, or when we give it to some of these other organizations, what are some of maybe the unintended consequences that we're not thinking about?
If you'd like to join our conversation with Granville trustee Bryn Bird, who is featured in the new documentary Represent, which is by Hillary Bachelder, you can text your question to 330-541-5794 or tweet it at the City Club. We'll work it into this part of the program. Hillary and Bryn are both our guests here at the City Club Friday Forum. Here's a comment from a listener. This is a wonderful conversation. I'm looking to run for a city council seat in the next few years, and this information will help. So congrats. So you can check off inspiring somebody to run for office on if that was one of your goals for today. Another question, Hillary, for you, what was the biggest struggle in filming this movie?
I chuckle because there are very, very parallel struggles of making a documentary and running for office. And it was
There's some
something
fundraising involved.
There is some fundraising, and that was one of the biggest challenges in making the film. You know, it's, yeah, I don't want to continue down this metaphorical path too far, but you know, the way that the sort of funding industry works within documentary is you have to film a certain amount and then you can present it and pitch it. There's a lot of public speaking actually that I was very nervous about, and got, you know, traded tips with some of these other ladies as they were figuring out their stump speeches. I was figuring out my version of a stump speech for the film. But essentially funding really comes in fits and starts, but you know, campaigning doesn't wait for you. And so when something important was happening, I just knew that I had to pick up my camera and drive out and be there, sort of regardless of wherever we stood with fundraising. So that's challenging, and that honestly takes kind of an emotional toll over several years when you're looking for more like consistency and reliability. So that was challenging.
It was helpful, though, I guess, that you limited yourself to Chicago, Detroit, and Greater Columbus. Yeah.
Originally, that was supposed to be a smaller window, but then Bryn's story was just too dang compelling. I had to make the 6-hour trip out. And so, it really was. Go ahead, Bryn.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, but there was like a 4th of July where Hillary made it to all of our 4th of July parades in like one day. And also the level of like professionalism of Hillary, that she did try to keep our relationship, you know, documentarian and subject or whatever. And so she would pack her little lunch because she didn't have enough funding to like eat out every time. And so she would show up with like her cooler of lunch, staying at this, you know, random Airbnb. And we would be like, we can feed you dinner. And she's like, no, like, this is fine. I'm separate from you. And my poor dad and my mom definitely, they worried about Hillary all the time. They hated that she was driving around. But yeah, she made it one time to all 3 of our 4th of July parades, and ran, you know, outside carrying a camera in the summer heat. So more power to you.
That was a very long week. And I do just want to say there's a happy ending to the story. We did eventually, we found all of our funding, so we were fully funded by the end. But yeah, touch and go there for a little while, and each of the, you know, Bryn, Maya, and Julie were all constantly like, you guys, you can crash on my couch, like, yeah, please come eat this food. And I was like, this is not your responsibility to like feed the starving artist who showed up to make the film about your life.
Hillary, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far, but when Bryn said that her parents were very worried about you, I was wondering if they would have been worried about you if you'd been a male documentarian, and was just thinking about the particular right, and about the particular challenges that women face in the documentary industry, in the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and it's true, it's real. I think it's a lot of kind of similar, like needing to prove yourself that extra step. So, you know, I think that's absolutely true in terms of who came on board and who supported. This is my first feature film, so I didn't have a track record to stand on. I just had kind of, here's my proof of concept, here's what we've been filming, here are the stories, and I can share some scenes or something. But I do think there's sort of an extra level that you have to go through, to the extra level of hoops to jump through. I also think that there is sort of a bias around stories about women. And so we were very often kind of slotted into a niche. You know, this couldn't be, and it's true, like this is a film about women in politics in particular. But because it's about women, we were like, oh, okay, so this is going to go on the women channel and only the women will watch it. And then, you know, it just gets slotted in a way that I don't think all of the movies that are out there, all of the great movies that are out there about men running for office, don't have to get slotted into this is a man politics movie niche. But one thing that I found, trying to use this sort of weakness as a strength, but as you know, as a young woman who was showing up with a camera, and I didn't have, for most of the film, we didn't have the funding for like a full sound crew, so I was doing the sound myself, and you know, I just had this little camera and was chasing around after Bryn, Maya, and Julie, but I had a pretty low or sort of minimal footprint as a filmmaker. And I think people I was often underestimated in that sense. I was asked a lot in Granville, was I a Denison student? And people sort of didn't look twice at me showing up to meetings and showing up to things. A little bit less true in Granville, where just small town. I think there was like some more level of like, who is that person? Who's that outsider who showed up? But I would say, especially in places like Chicago and Detroit, kind of big cities, like, I was sort of underestimated because I was a young woman with a smaller set of camera gear. And that worked in my favor because people talked to me. They let me into places that maybe wasn't always in their best interest to let me into. And that's just, unfortunately the reality, but it's the one that I've tried to use kind of to my advantage.
Bryn, a question for you. What advice would you give to women thinking about running for office?
Yeah, I think the advice that I have is to really know the position you're considering. I think there is a little bit of a tendency right now of saying like, you should run for Congress as a first step. And I'm not saying, and I know that there's also people that say, well, men run for Congress as their first step, and you're just saying this, but I'm not. I do think that, understanding the position you're really looking for, and also not being afraid of starting out in a position at the local level, even really local, and moving from there to understand how running for office works. And also, finding that team that's going to be in your corner. That was huge for me, is having that group that sat around my kitchen table and would go over plans with me and helped me know, simple things like people who had already won office, simple things of, where do you order signs from? How much is a bumper sticker? Do I go out and canvass on Sundays or Saturdays? Those simple questions were huge. And I asked a lot of people who had already won office. Stephanie Dodd, who's a state school board member, she sat and gave me like, Sunday nights did not work out good. Go for Saturdays. And I think about that too. That was one thing I did for a community, is having small children. I had a lot of friends who wanted to help me and didn't know how, may not have had the financial resources. They didn't want to canvas. And so I created a Google Calendar, like a sign me up genius thing, and to have my kids watch. When you run for federal level, they have changed the campaign finance that you can use money that you have raised for childcare, but at the state level in Ohio, they have not changed that. And so money that you raise for any state or local election in the state of Ohio cannot be used towards childcare. And so that was one expensive thing that I knew I was going to face. And so I had a volunteer to watch my children sign up sheet. And I think I had 20 people sign up. And so when I would go out canvassing or I'd have meetings, I knew who'd have my kids covered because that was just a cost I couldn't take on personally. And that was a great way to have the community stand behind me, and my kids loved it because then they got to go to all these new friends' houses and play with dogs, and so I think about that. But that's something that at the state, I still think women should work towards, is to have campaign finance reform in letting our campaign dollars that we raise go towards childcare, because that is a huge barrier for women who may not have been like me in a tiny town where they trusted everybody to watch their children.
That sounds like a fairly straightforward legislative fix. I'm sure it's more complicated than I imagined, but that's very helpful. Gerrymandering has, you mentioned it earlier, Hillary, as the issue that was the sort of crossover issue in Illinois. It's an issue here in Ohio as well, an issue really everywhere in the country. How the specific question, though, is how does it impact women running for office?
That's a good question.
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think Bryn could even speak to this as well, just as someone who's considered kind of the higher levels of office. And, I just across the board, gerrymandering benefits incumbents. And if the issue is that, there aren't enough women in office currently, you're not going to get more women in office without replacing some incumbents. But if those incumbents are able to draw a district that's most favorable to them, then we're going to have a really hard time meeting that parity benchmark. But I think Bryn can speak to that personally too in Ohio.
I live in a, we all do, right? I live in a gerrymandered district as well, like from the state to federal. And so the idea of me running for higher office has always felt almost unattainable, that, I've reached my peak, because running for higher office in our community is going to be overcoming a pretty slanted, one-sided voting. And I do live in the Troy Balderson district, District 12, that was gerrymandered, but then Daniel O'Connor, really did come close to winning right when I was running for office. So it was interesting to watch that happen. But I would agree with Hillary, and I think that gerrymandering and Julie's story showed that it is a bipartisan issue. And I think that both sides of the aisle agree that gerrymandering just creates extremes and does do away with some fair process. So I do hope that we're at a breaking point in that, where we all kind of see that this is a bipartisan issue.
It feels important to mention too that in the state of Ohio, the whole nation is doing the census right now. The census will count every person, so that the district lines can be redrawn after the census. So that's my very subtle way of encouraging people to participate in the census. But also in Ohio, Bryn, we've got redistricting reform measures that have been voted in, created into law, legislatively approved, and will go into effect with the new redistricting and reapportionment that happens after the census. So fingers crossed that here's hoping, right, that works in favor of democracy. We are at the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. What conversation do you think we'll be having about women in politics 50 or 100 years from now, Bryn Bird?
Well, hopefully by then we have a woman president. I always say, I remember being an elementary school kid, and they would point and say, you could be the first woman president. And even as a little kid, I thought, I have to wait until I'm an adult to have a woman president. Like, that's your goal. And thought that was so terrible. And watching my 6-year-old Emlyn, who is irate that there is not a woman candidate for president right now. And she will be sitting in the back of the car and bringing it up like, Mom, I just don't get, she said, do you know how there's a lot of protests happening right now? Is there a protest right now for getting a woman as president? And I said, there isn't, bud, but we can go do it. She's ready. And so I think
she's 6. Did you say she's 6?
She's 6 years old. Mm-hmm.
That's great.
And so she is ready. And so I hope that, by then we do have just more women in office, and that, that there isn't this year of the woman. I think Hillary talks about that and does a great job of saying that we're done with that it's not the year of the woman. And, the poster over Hillary's shoulder too, that, why stop at 50%? I look at Colorado, that is, Colorado is the first, and isn't Nevada the second? But Colorado is the first to adopt or to have over 50% women in state legislation. And I just look at that, and you can kind of already start to see some of the changes they are making around policies for maternity leave or paternity leave, and around some of the family health care, that I think is just so positive and shows that, when we have representation and women bringing that viewpoint of family into legislation, the changes that are going to happen. So hopefully in 100 years, we say, wow, look what happened when women got in office and started to hold majorities. We really made some headway.
Hillary Bachelder, how do you see it? Or what do you hope to be talking about?
I love this version of the future that Bryn is painting. So I truly hope that is where we're at. I've spent a little bit, maybe too much time looking at the more depressing statistics that say, at our current sort of like incremental rate of change, it will take 100 years for us to like inch to parity. And so I think we'll be there, but I know that there's an intervention that needs to happen to get us there faster. Because the issue isn't that women win office at a lesser rate than men do. That is factually inaccurate. Women win at the same rate that men do. It's an issue of how many women are running, but it's also a huge issue of what are the structural systemic barriers that are still in place for candidates, and as well as for women once they're elected. Something that we brought up in Bryn's story after she is in office is, sorry, Bryn, you're not making very much money as a township trustee, and that makes that position so unappealing for anyone who needs a steady and reasonable income. And so Bryn points out, like, well, this is why all the other folks who are holding this office are kind of old retired guys, because they can do it as a hobby. And so I think that there are very deliberate interventions that need to happen to make this position more appealing, to attract more women to run, and to make it possible for them to be successful once they do run and win. So I hope that that's what I can reflect back and see has really changed in the next 50 years.
Hilary Bachelder is the director, cinematographer, and editor of the film Represent. Bryn Bird is featured in that. She's a Granville Township trustee. Hilary Bachelder and Bryn Bird, thank you so much for joining us for the City Club Friday Forum today, and congratulations to you both.
Thanks for having us. This is great.
We are going to continue to present our forums throughout this time, either on virtual platforms or here from the CIFFStreams studios, and we encourage you to continue to show up for them. Our forum today is the Peter de Leon Endowed Forum on Local Politics. On Friday, August 21st, we'll talk with national thought leaders about modern Indigenous representation, inclusion, and the stories we tell ourselves about American history. If you have other ideas about topics we should cover, please get in touch. We're at cityclub.org. I'm Dan Moulthrop. Stay strong, stay healthy. Please wash your hands, keep your distance, and wear a mask, and stay close in your hearts if you can't be close in person. Our forum is adjourned.